Hi, my name is Minh-Thu, and for my mini-term project this year, I decided to research affirmative action and its impact on the NCSSM community. Affirmative action can be daunting, just like this building scene here. You can think of many things, such as race, the Harvard lawsuit, unconstitutional, or just college acceptances overall. And these are all just small factors that feed into the definition and perception of affirmative action. That was the intent of my research, to analyze lawsuits, surveys, contemporary news, all of these which can influence the NCSSM perspective. But it really starts with what is affirmative action, and how has it changed over the past century? Affirmative action has several definitions available that you can find on the internet. These are just two that I found below pertaining to education. Both of these focus on underrepresentation, non-discrimination, and minorities. How did it start? It really started before the Civil Rights Movement, when minorities were often excluded from certain careers. Asian Americans couldn't get promoted, while Black and Latino students and prospective employees were often denied certain positions. John F. Kennedy passed Executive Order 10925, which was the first time that affirmative action was officially declared in a government documentation. And as it says below, employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. Moving on from there were more executive acts and plans that have been passed, such as Executive Order 11246, which says that all business firms that work with the government must apply non-discriminatory standards. And in 1969, there was the Philadelphia Plan, which said that more minority recruitment is necessary for governmental jobs. This was particularly for construction jobs, but as it evolved, it later on was for other jobs that was set in place. So, what about pertaining to education? It really has to make you think back to Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed segregation for particularly elementary, middle, and high schools. However, at colleges, there was still low minority recruitment throughout, especially for underrepresented minorities. So in 1971, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare required that all universities that are federally funded to have affirmative action. This ultimately resulted in minority numbers beginning to increase. There were only about 5% of Black students in 1965 and 9% of Black students in 1980. And this was the same thing for many other underrepresented minorities and minorities as well. So then there was the Regents of the University of California versus Alan Bakke. This was in 1978 and was the first case about affirmative action in terms of education. A white male student by the last name of Bakke was denied to the University of California, Berkeley Medical School. He had qualifying scores, so he sued the university saying that they discriminated against his race. And further evaluation found that UC Berkeley was reserving 16 spots out of 100 for minority students. The court declared this unconstitutional by the 14th Amendment and concluded that racial quotas must not be in any sort of college admissions process. And as you can see here, this was highly publicized, such as in Time magazine, which was dated in 1978. Kind of back to the general overview, in the 1980s Ronald Reagan was president, and he was a big part of halting the progress of affirmative action. He appointed Supreme Court justices that were against affirmative action, and he also cut funding for certain cases that were for affirmative action and non-discrimination. In the 1990s, certain civil rights ballot initiatives that allowed for certain states to pass an outlaw race as a factor for admission. So now, how did affirmative action change in the 21st century? And for this one in particular, I analyzed surveys, contemporary news, and lawsuits. But the big focus is lawsuits. And before I dive in, the first thing that we need to make sure of is each college has a different approach. Schools are getting sued for particular approaches that they have towards affirmative action, and every single school has a different case. So diving in, the first case is Grass versus Bollinger. In 1995 and 1997, two students were denied admission to the University of Michigan's College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. They sued the school saying that they discriminated against race, which is against the 14th Amendment, with an organization called Center for Individual Rights. This case was brought up to the Supreme Court in 2003, and that's when they took further analysis on how University of Michigan was admitting students. They had 5 criteria: school quality, curriculum strength, unusual circumstances, geographical residence, and alumni relationships. If you were an underrepresented minority, such as a Latinx American, Native American, or African American, you automatically got 20 points to your system. However, if you had a perfect SAT score, on the other hand, you only got 12. The minimum amount of points to get accepted into this college was 100 points. So as you can see, it took 20% of the minimum points to be a minority to get accepted to this school. The Supreme Court declared this to be unconstitutional and said that race should not become such a predominant factor as this particular case. The same year, Barbara Grutter was applying to the University of Michigan Law School. She was denied admission in 1997, but the court case was brought up in the same year in 2003. She had an LSAT score of 161 and 3.8 GPA. So this law school did admit that they used race as a factor for admissions, as a compelling interest in achieving diversity among its student body. This case was brought up to the Supreme Court, as I said before, and the court concluded that because race was not a predominant factor, it was not in violation of the 14th Amendment. More recently, Fisher versus University of Texas. This involves Abigail Fisher, a white female student, and the University of Texas system. But before we dive into that, it must be known about the top 10% rule. This was passed in 1997 as the Texas House Bill 588. It basically stated that all students that were in the top 10% of their schools within Texas were automatically admitted to any school within the University of Texas system. However, if you were not in the top 10%, other factors applied, such as race. Abigail Fisher was denied to the University of Texas Austin in 2003, and she teamed up with the Project on Fair Representation in order to sue them. The head litigator for this was Edward Blum, which you'll hear about later on, in particular in another specific case. They said that race hurt her chances of enrollment as a factor, and this case was soon brought up to the Supreme Court in 2016. As you can see, pictured left is Edward Blum, and pictured right is Abigail Fisher, the defendant. A little bit more background about the case in general. As I said before, it required the top 10%. And as you can see, she had 180 SAT score and a 3.59 GPA, which meant she didn't qualify for the top 10%. Additionally, 42 white students and 5 Latino students with lower test scores were offered admission within the same year. And admissions did admit they evaluated it based on a certain amount of criteria: grades, test scores, required essays, leadership, activities, service, and special circumstances. Special circumstances meant either having low socioeconomic status, single-parent household, or race. Abigail Fisher and the Project on Fair Representation wanted admissions to be race-blind, but after long deliberation by the Supreme Court, they ruled that race-conscious admissions were allowed and that it can continue within the University of Texas system. So now more recently, many have heard about the Harvard lawsuit, Students for Fair Admissions against Harvard University. Although it hasn't become a Supreme Court case, it is highly controversial, and it serves to be the first case that says minorities are being discriminated against specifically. So who are Students for Fair Admissions? It's a conservative-leaning organization that favors colorblind admissions versus socioeconomic selection, which is what they want to have for admissions overall. They sued Harvard University, saying that they had discrimination against Asian Americans, requesting for certain documents for admissions to be pulled up. Once doing so, they also said that Harvard University denied admission to Asian Americans, even suggesting that they were at a higher standard or a quota. So, diving into more of the case, Students for Fair Admissions appointed a Duke economist, and he analyzed the Harvard admission process, which can be categorized into 5 categories: academic, extracurricular, athletic, personal, and overall. As you can see, I've highlighted these certain colors, and based on his findings, he found that Asian Americans had the largest disadvantages in personal and overall versus having excelling scores for admissions in academic and extracurricular. He accused Harvard University of having Asian Americans have an admissions penalty, also saying that if race was not considered, Asian American admissions would increase by 14%. Additionally, SFFA, or Students for Fair Action, overall just had strong emphasis on statistical results, focusing on the results that Peter provided overall. However, Harvard University emphasized on individual experiences, having students come in and talk about the benefits of affirmative action. Many underrepresented minorities that continue to go into Harvard University today felt that Harvard University had a diverse population, and without affirmative action, they felt like that the amount of underrepresented minorities would decrease. So what was Harvard's case for against Students for Fair Admissions? It really started with University of California, Berkeley economist David Card. He also did a statistical model and said that Asian Americans don't have a boost nor an admissions penalty. He also said that the previous economist case did not consider legacies, preoccupations, or intended measures in his analysis, all of which are important factors for admissions today. He finally admitted that African Americans and Hispanics do have some advantage, African Americans especially, but it's in a more nuanced way than it was presented at the court. 16 selected institutions around the United States wrote a letter in agreement to Harvard's admissions considerations. The case is still going on. The judge is still deciding who wins overall, but this case has been huge, especially at NCSSM. But what does the general survey think? How do people perceive lawsuits? How do people perceive contemporary news? Surveys have been released throughout the years about affirmative action overall. Starting in 2007, 70% said that they favor affirmative action to help blacks, women, and other minorities to get better jobs and education. In 2014, Americans overall had a stronger support for affirmative action on college campuses. But once you dive into the Supreme Court cases, many are opposed. Most opposed use of preferences to improve position of minorities. Meanwhile, in terms of Fisher versus the University of Texas, 65% said that they didn't want college to consider race as a factor for admissions. They didn't approve of the Supreme Court's decision. And recently, this was another poll created by Gallup, which asked, should applicants be admitted based on merit or consideration of race? And 67% said solely on merit rather than accounting race. And much recently, within this week, 73% of Americans said that race should not be considered as a factor for admissions. With all of these in mind, it really comes to think, how have the contemporary news headlines influenced them? These are some of the many things that you can see when you go online. All of these influences are subconscious or conscious in general. We all have to think, how have these affected us? And how have these affected us as NCSSM students? I interviewed 16 students at NCSSM and asked them 14 questions about affirmative action, all while observing the general trends for each interview. The first question I asked was, define affirmative action. And the key terms included diversity, opportunity, marginalized groups, race, more resources, and minorities. Those are specific results below, but 2 out of 16 students didn't know what affirmative action was. In order to supply them with a definition, I used one from the National Conference of State Legislators. Then I asked, what are your thoughts on affirmative action? A majority said fully positive, while some had some reservations. Asian males had more reservations than Asian females, and black males thought affirmative action was beneficial, but they still had some reservations about it. Meanwhile, 50% said that affirmative action would benefit individuals that have less opportunities, especially underrepresented minorities. And about half said that affirmative action specifically benefits minorities when asked on their thoughts on affirmative action. Those are more general responses seen here. The next question I asked were, what sources have you heard about affirmative action? And these can be listed in 5 different categories. The first most heard were general information, contemporary news sources, and students at NCSSM. General information meant reading the basic definition, whether by a Google search or just reading it in a recent article. Contemporary news sources included conservative and liberal news sources, and one news source in particular that was often referenced was Vox. Students at NCSSM were just heard among their peers, especially their friends. Next was discussions in classrooms at home school. Not NCSSM, but whether in their civics and economics class or their history class, their home schools did cover affirmative action in at least one of their subjects. The next most heard was the Harvard lawsuit. 3 out of 16 students said they heard about the affirmative action first by the Harvard lawsuit or heard about it overall. And lastly, family. Only 2 out of 16 students said that they heard about affirmative action from their families. The next question I asked was, how do you feel about Greta versus Bollinger? And then, how do you feel about Grass versus Bollinger? Those are the 2 previous cases that I introduced in the introduction. Students felt that they agreed with the court's decision for Greta versus Bollinger, and that the University of Michigan should not give 20 points or 20% automatic increase to minorities. Meanwhile, for Grass versus Bollinger, a majority did agree that race should not become a predominant factor, and they agreed with the court's decision that the college should still uphold their admissions process today. Then I asked what their thoughts were on holistic review. The definition used below was provided in the interviews, and all students said that holistic review was necessary for colleges to consider an individual's full application rather than just one specific part, which was primarily academic achievement. The next question I asked was, who do you believe benefits from affirmative action? And many students had to take a pause for this question and the two questions that follow. It was hard to think of who exactly quantifies for benefits versus who exactly quantifies for other categories. General responses included minorities and everyone. Other responses were no one, white males, and some minorities. Most students who said everyone said a more diverse population contributes to a better collegiate experience. Meanwhile, people who said that it does benefit you, at the same time it doesn't, said that it doesn't benefit non-minorities when trying to go into the schools, but when they are admitted, students have a more diverse experience. Someone who said some minorities was specifically talking about the Harvard lawsuit and felt that Asian Americans and Caucasian Americans didn't necessarily have the same benefits as other underrepresented minorities. Then I asked, who do you believe is disadvantaged because of affirmative action? The general responses included non-minorities, Asian Americans, and nobody. Meanwhile, other responses included unsure and everybody. Individuals who said minorities in the previous question responded with non-minorities, and the 3 students who said Asian Americans cited the Harvard lawsuit as their source for affirmative action. The student who said everybody emphasized that affirmative action disadvantages minorities and non-minorities. Minorities because they feel like they've been admitted due to their skin color, and non-minorities because it is more competitive and harder to get into specific schools. Then I asked, do you believe that affirmative action benefits or disadvantages you? And then although I expected for students to say it advantages me or disadvantages me based on their skin color or ethnic identity, in reality it was mixed. General responses did say benefits, but other students said both and unsure. Other responses included disadvantaged, who felt like they were more competitive within their demographic, and neutral. Minorities who said benefits felt like they had a stronger chance to go to college because of affirmative action. Meanwhile, white students that said that it varied in benefits and disadvantages, they also said that they might be neutral about the situation. Students who answered uncertain were all of minority descent, and students who answered both were unsure of their acceptance, but they were sure about the diversity on campus that would give them a better collegiate experience overall. So then I asked, with all of this in mind, do you think that affirmative action should change or stay the same? And students responded that it should change. But how? They wanted to have greater transparency. They felt like affirmative action wasn't being discussed enough by colleges and the admissions process in general. Many students confessed to me that they felt that they didn't know much about affirmative action until they started interviewing with me. Next, a greater focus on socioeconomic status, or even complete elimination of race-conscious admissions. Next was the inclusion of other minority groups, because they felt like there was discrimination towards specific minorities. Students who referenced this felt like there was discrimination against Asian Americans. And finally, a stronger focus towards holistic review, rather than assessing an applicant based on their academic achievements, more so on their entire background and experience. So what were the overall perceptions of affirmative action at NCSSM? The following questions that I will discuss really asked what they heard at NCSSM as well as how they felt about it. So what are some of the things you've heard about affirmative action at NCSSM? I took the most notable examples and statements that students have said that they've heard around the school. The general responses were, I haven't heard anything about affirmative action, versus, I heard that this black student got in because of their skin color, or at least that's what students would say. These are opposite ends of the ignorant spectrum. So with that in mind, I asked them, did you believe that the current perception about affirmative action is more negative or more positive? And unsurprisingly, a majority of the students said more negative. Students who felt like the climate was neutral felt like there wasn't enough discussion about affirmative action, or there was misinformation overall. Meanwhile, a majority of students who said more negative were of minority descent. All Black males and Asian males in particular responded negative. Students who said that there was a more positive atmosphere said that NCSSM valued culture and diversity as a reason for why it was more positive overall. So throughout the interviews, there were common misconceptions that I heard. The first one being, affirmative action has racial quotas. This is false. So they were outlawed in 1978 after the Regents of University of California versus Bakke. Next, NCSSM has race-conscious admissions. This is also false. Race is not considered as a factor when they're evaluating applications, and they only use it as a demographic. Only when students discuss race in their essays, it is considered as a part of their application, but not necessarily as a factor for admissions. So how does NCSSM's admissions process work? They have 13 congressional districts that the student body must represent, and they do look at several factors, which include academic achievement, standardized testing, extracurriculars, and essays, but not race. The system is praised today by many schools within this consortium, and it continues to admit a diverse population within NCSSM. So these are the sources that I used throughout the presentation before I dive into kind of the conclusions and key points that I want to cover. Key points and conclusions. The first being, affirmative action needs to be discussed at a greater length at NCSSM. When I was talking to students, many were misinformed, or they didn't know exactly how to feel about certain situations, citing that they didn't necessarily have the resources or know exactly what affirmative action was talked about. I feel like affirmative action should be discussed more within the classroom as well as outside the classroom. Although it is a touchy subject to talk about overall, college acceptances and rejections and decisions overall can be difficult, it is necessary to discuss. Facts versus opinions are more important when assessing your own opinion on affirmative action or any controversial subject. Next, there is a strong distinction between the college admissions process and the NCSSM admission process. As I said before, NCSSM does not consider race, and each college has a different admissions process, some of which include race as a factor, and some of which don't. As I said before, certain states do outlaw affirmative action or race as a factor into admissions, and we must have that in mind when we apply to these colleges or even discuss these colleges. Next, affirmative action's original intention is not for racial groups to compete against one another. When I was talking to students, many felt the benefits versus disadvantages, and many felt like they were competing against other students in order to earn a spot or even have a spot in certain colleges. However, affirmative action's original intention was to increase the number of minorities within certain jobs, certain aspects of education that weren't necessarily receiving at the time, especially within the civil rights movement. Next, race has a strong correlation with socioeconomic status. This is especially true for underrepresented minorities who are still being denied jobs because of their skin color or just simply how their hair appears, or etc., etc. Meanwhile, race has a strong correlation with socioeconomic status, and this can be further discussed. If you would like to talk to me individually, that would be fine. And finally, skin color does not directly correlate with college acceptances. Hard work and determination does. As I said before, many students have heard that this student got admitted because they're Black, or this student got admitted because they were underrepresented minority. When you say these to these individuals, it undermines all of the hard work that they did. And once again, affirmative action is simply just one factor into the college admissions process. There also is consideration for extracurriculars, SAT scores, standardized testing, or just academic achievement overall. All of these factors are added into the college admissions process, and although we don't necessarily know what each college defines as what is greater than the other, affirmative action is never an overbearing factor, as you saw in the lawsuits that I presented today. So I'd like to give a special thank you to Dr. Brandon, all 16 interviewees, and NCSSM admissions for giving me the opportunity to do this research that mini-term. I hope that throughout your discussions for affirmative action, there's more information rather than misconceptions that are discussed today. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a good day.